So I want to start by thanking Kate Hewitt very much for joining us today. Kate is currently working at the United States National Nuclear Security Administration. And I'm going to let her talk a little bit to you guys about her portfolio. But one of the reasons that we're having Kate come and talk is that it wasn't that long ago that Kate was in your position, right? Where she was an undergrad and then getting a master's degree and deciding what she wanted to do, whether or not what she was interested in doing. And so I want her to have an opportunity to tell you a little bit about what she does as a nuclear expert today, but also a little bit about what her pathway there is. And if you guys were listening to us chatting at the beginning, a really important part of that pathway early on was that she won a really important fellowship. It's the Herbert Scoville Peace Fellowship. And that's how you worked at Brookings, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that funded a research assistant position for her at Brookings, which is one of the major think tanks. It's kind of like Chatham House in the UK, but it's one of the major think tanks in Washington, D.C. that deals with these issues. So that's where Kate got started, and she's now working as a public affairs spokeswoman for the NNSA. So I just want to start out, Kate, by asking you, like, how did you get introduced to this field, right? This is kind of a niche thing. And what was it? Where did you first encounter it? What interested you about it? Like, how did you end up on this path?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. I love speaking with students, partly because there are not that many young women in the nuclear field. And, every time I always had a speaker in one of my classes, they were much older, which is great. They have so much expertise to bring to the table, but it's very hard to see how you get from point A to point B with a person like that. And so I love speaking with students, and I'm happy to chat with any of you anytime you want. Anne has all my contact information, so please share, but thank you. So I think everybody that you'll talk to in this field has a very roundabout way of how they got here. But my background is a little unique in that I grew up in a small town called Richland, Washington in the US. And my hometown was part of the Manhattan Project. So back during World War II era, my hometown produced the plutonium that was used in the bomb that the US dropped on Nagasaki. So I grew up in this town that was, fundamentally born because of a nuclear project, and to this day still has a profound history and relationship with the nuclear field. We still have a lot of government operations out there, cleanup taking place from the Manhattan Project, several labs, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is out there. So yeah, I grew up in this town. My mascot at my high school, we were the Bombers. Our mascot was a mushroom cloud. So I have a pretty unique history just with nukes all on their own. And I loved politics and I loved government when I was growing up. I was very into what was happening in the news, but I wasn't a science person. I didn't know anything about how to have a career in this field that wasn't science related. And I certainly wasn't going to be a physicist or a nuclear engineer. So I didn't really, I kind of cast that aside, but it was always sort of there in the back of my mind. My great grandfather worked at the Manhattan Project. So I was interested in nuclear. Again, thought I wanted to go to law school. I was interested in human rights. So I ended up doing the Peace Corps. And while I was in the Peace Corps, and I had these great grand ideas of doing international human rights law. I realized that that was probably not the right path for me. I didn't really want to do international development, and I thought that the legal field was maybe not the right path for me to go, but I was still interested in human rights and government service. And so when I started applying for jobs post Peace Corps, basically everything that I liked required a master's degree. So I kind of thought that was the right path for me to take. And I ended up doing my master's in global studies, a very small program that was in its second year at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I applied for that program to study human rights for persons with disabilities in Eastern Europe, because that is what I had been doing for the last 2 years. And that program likes to joke that I'm sort of their wild card, because they accepted me on that premise. And then by the end of my first semester, I was doing human rights and weapons of mass destruction. And then by the end of my 2 years of my master's degree was really not looking at the human rights aspect so much as the legal ramifications and the interests of states and why they pursue nuclear weapons and the elements that go into that. So along the way, I had an internship in nuclear energy. I spent 6 months at MIT doing an internship on also nuclear technology. And so probably all of the signs should have been there along the way that this is where I was going to end up, but I still didn't really realize that there is a whole other realm in the nuclear space that is not, you don't have to be a scientific expert to do. So while it helps to understand the science, you don't have to be a scientist. So yeah, I became a policy person. That was my focus during my master's degree, and this is where I ended up. And I'm so happy that I'm here. I absolutely love this field. I think it's a fascinating field to be in, and that's how I ended up here.
That's awesome. So one of the things that I think I want to echo out of what you were saying, which I think is really important and resonates strongly with me, is that this early on in your career, one of the things that a lot of people do is start down one path and find out it's not for them, right? So it's kind of like some of the most important work that people do right out of undergraduate is sometimes not so much finding out what they want to do, which eventually you did, right? But first you kind of figured out what you didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that's so great about having you come and talk to people, because I think that sometimes just hearing other people's experiences of doing that, one, makes it feel normal that happens. And two, also helps people get a better idea about, like, the more you hear from people who are actually working the field, the more you understand whether or not something's right for you. So I absolutely love that you shared your short detour around along the way. So the Hewlett Fellowship is pretty competitive. How did you find out about it? How did you decide to apply for it? What was that process like? Was it linked to the Brookings Institution automatically, or did you choose where you wanted to go?
Yeah. So when I started figuring out in grad school that I was writing my thesis and taking all of my classes and focusing all my effort on nuclear issues, on proliferation theory and the Iran nuclear deal, and I was studying Farsi, and I wasn't really thinking at the time, like, oh, how am I going to, I'm going to graduate and I need a job. And all I have been doing for the last year and a half is studying nukes. So how do I, parlay that into a career? So I was just Googling, honestly, one day, nuclear policy fellowships, DC, nuclear jobs, DC, internships, all the keywords that I could think of. And the Herbert Scoville Junior Peace Fellowship popped up. It was actually my first year of my master's program, of a 2-year master's program, that I found it. And I looked at the details of it, and it was a fully paid 6 to 9 month fellowship with an institution or an organization in DC focused on a variety of issues, one of which is nuclear. And I thought, this is great, but you could only apply 2 times during the year, and you had to be ready to graduate when that time comes. So I put it on a little sticky note that I have on my laptop, where I was sort of keeping track of things that I found with the due date of when I should be applying for it. In my second year of my master's program, I did apply for it when I was also applying for a bunch of other jobs. The Scoville Fellowship is a highly competitive, like I said, 6 to 12 month fellowship that brings you to DC. And it's paid. It's not great pay, but it is paid, which makes all the difference in the world when you're just getting out of school. And they partner with a whole bunch of organizations that do everything sort of social justice related. The person who started at Herbert Scoville had a long history of being a nuclear scientist, working in the field, and found that it was very important to him to bring new voices into the field, and that's how the fellowship got started. But it's broadened out, so now they do climate change and authoritarian regime studies and peace and security research, sort of anything that falls into that realm. And they have, I think, over 50 organizations now that they partner with. So the way that it works is you apply for the fellowship itself, and then if you make it to the final round, they bring you to DC and you interview with 5 to 6 organizations that you are interested in working at. And then on the last day of your interviews, you interview with the Scoville board. And if you end up getting the fellowship, then you rank where you interviewed at. And unless that organization really didn't like you, to be honest, they basically take you because you're free labor. You know, somebody else is paying for you to be there. And one of the best things about that is that the Brookings Institution in DC, like Anne said, it's a very prominent think tank. You know, it's one of the best think tanks in the world. And it's incredibly hard to get in there. Unless you know somebody or, you know, cured cancer, you have a hard shot of getting in. And I saw that as I worked there, because I ended up staying after my fellowship as well. That, you know, there were 600, 700 people applying for, you know, an internship position, and it's just tricky. So one of the things that I think is super helpful is that fellowships are kind of a back door into a lot of organizations like Brookings that are hard to get into. And there are so many different ways to either get a federal job in the US or get into a think tank or an advocacy organization where you might not otherwise have the chance if you have already gotten the fellowship. So I encourage students to, instead of, you know, definitely still apply for the jobs, but think about roundabout ways of getting there as well. And the Herbert Scoville Peace Fellowship, if you're interested in peace and security studies, is a phenomenal opportunity and propelled literally my career in this field.
So that one is, it's US based, but it's not US citizens only. It's
correct.
Correct. Okay, because so one thing I want to say to you guys is later in the semester, we are going to have someone come speak, someone who works at RUSI, which is one of the think tanks in London, so that you guys will also get to hear a little bit about somebody who got their master's in the UK and then went on to work in a think tank in the UK. Something I want to follow up on for all of you that Kate said, just so you know, I feel like people don't tell students this, and I don't know why. If you're going to ask someone for a letter of recommendation for one of these fellowships, this is what you need to do. At least 2 weeks in advance of the due date, you need to contact that person. You need to send them a link to the fellowship, to the program, to whatever it is that you want to apply, so that they can look at and understand what you're applying to. And then you want to send them all of your materials that the admissions committee is going to see. You want to send them your personal statement, your transcripts, everything. So they need to be able to see your application, and then they can write you a really great letter, especially if they already know you. So your personal tutor sometimes can do that for you. It's one of the reasons why you want to sometimes make appointments for office hours with your professors, because you want to make sure someone knows who you are. But I think that this is like this juncture, and the idea that there's multiple pathways. You don't have to apply directly to an organization. If you apply for a fellowship, it actually can open doors for you that may not have been opened otherwise. It's really awesome advice, Kate. Thank you. So I want to get to what you're actually doing now, but will you tell us a little bit about what you did at Brookings?
Mhm.
And then how did the transition work from that job to your current role? And why did you make that transition? Like you could have stayed
Yeah.
at Brookings, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
or worked at another think tank, but you decided to work in a government public affairs role. So what was
Yeah.
attractive to you about that in comparison to your responsibilities at the think tank?
Absolutely. Great question. So I finished my fellowship. So when I was there for my fellowship, I primarily wanted to work at Brookings with somebody whose name was Robert Einhorn, and he had worked at the State Department for a very long time, has a very impressive resume, but was one of the architects of the Iran nuclear deal, which was obviously what I, had spent a long time studying during my master's degree. And he's just highly respected in the field, and I really wanted to learn from him. So I came to Brookings, and he was my primary supervisor. So I was doing some research with him on 2 manuscripts that ended up getting published much later, honestly, while I was still at Brookings, but after I became a research assistant. And but while I was there, I also met Jung Pak, who is the chair right now of the Korea Studies program at Brookings. I might be butchering that, but she started on the same day that I did and previously worked on the National Security Council and at the CIA, and she was one of the analysts for Kim Jong-un. And besides being just stunningly brilliant, she was incredibly kind, a powerhouse. I mean, very well spoken, very well respected, just carries herself with all kinds of charisma, and I just fell in love with her basically. And she became one of my closest mentors still to this day in the field. But while I was there, I hadn't really studied anything about Korea issues, and naturally at that same time, North Korea seemed to be launching several devices. And so I took the opportunity to learn from her and wrote a paper on sanctions policy under her guidance as well. So sort of using my work with Bob as a starting point, and then curving to find something else that I also found really interesting, which broadened my portfolio, and then also, managed to bring in not just nuclear, but also strategic stability and ballistic missiles and delivery systems and all kinds of different technology that I hadn't really thought about before. So it sort of started to broaden my spectrum. And while I was a research assistant, a Herbert Scoville fellow, you're technically not supposed to do any administrative work, but their research assistant position for Bob Einhorn, and somebody knew that they brought on Frank Rose, was vacant, and I knew that they were trying to fill that position, and I knew that my fellowship was ending. So I strategically started doing some of that admin work, like putting on roundtable events, which everybody should do. You should always put on events. You learn so much that way. You get so many contacts that way. I just started doing all of the things that I thought made me sort of indispensable. And at the end of my fellowship, I said, well, I want that job. And they were like, well, you're basically already doing it. And I was like, okay, great. And so then they hired me. I still had to interview for it, but I had sort of an unfair advantage. And then I stayed for another 11 months while I was there, doing research, but also the admin stuff for both Bob and Frank Rose, who was also studying space issues, UK alliance, US-Russia relations, underwater unarmed vehicles. I mean, a whole slew of other security issues. So that really, helped me learn what I liked and what I didn't like. Again, a very important topic. But I wanted to write, and I wanted to, that there were some limitations to what you can do as a research assistant at a think tank. Everybody has their own sort of policies, and I felt like I was getting a tiny bit stifled in getting my own, sort of thoughts and perspectives out there. And I did feel like I had things that I wanted to say. So that was sort of the pushing point for me to want to get out of the think tank land. But also, I want to have a long career in this field. And to do that, I felt like what was missing was understanding how policy is made, really minute details of what happens day in and day out in the government related to these issues. I just started to notice that there were things that I didn't understand, and I couldn't understand them unless I was fundamentally working in the government and not outside in think tank world. And so that sort of led me to say, it's time for me to go. This is not the place for me long term. I don't want to stay in academia long term. And I applied for another fellowship called the NGFP, the Next Generation Fellows Program, NGFP fellowship at the NNSA, which is for people who have just either finished their master's degree or their undergraduate degree or their PhD to enter into the National Nuclear Security Administration. It's a one-year fellowship, very well paid, and you end up at one of the labs or the field offices. So I applied for that fellowship. I got 3 interviews. So you apply to the fellowship again, and then NNSA, all the offices get your resumes, and then they decide if they want to interview you. So you could get no interviews, you could get 8 interviews, and I got 3. And I thought 2 of those interviews went very well. And here's another life lesson for you. I did not get the fellowship, much to the surprise of myself, honestly, and some other people. But it ended up being a blessing in disguise, because one of the offices that I interviewed with sent me an email, actually before I found out I didn't get the fellowship, that said, you were one of our top candidates and we really liked you, but unfortunately, we decided to go in a different direction this time. However, we do think that you'd be a great addition at NNSA, and so we're going to pass your resume around, and here are some contacts of people you should reach out to. And so they passed my resume around. Somebody reached out to me and said, we have an opening through a federal contractor, and we'd like you to apply for that position. So I ended up applying for the federal contract job, and within 6 days of my applying for that job, I had an offer that was above what the fellowship would have paid me, and was above what I was asked for. So to be there, sometimes things really, one door closes and the right one opens for you, and this was that case for me. So it wasn't exactly where I thought I would end up. I started at NNSA as an action officer and program analyst in the Office of Safety, Infrastructure, and Operations, which was looking at all safety things related across all 8 of NNSA's sites. Just to back up a little bit, so the National Nuclear Security Administration is a semi-autonomous federal agency underneath the Department of Energy, which is responsible for all of the United States nuclear weapons. So assembly, disassembly, production, materials management and removal from other countries, anything nuclear weapons related actually falls under the Department of Energy, specifically the NNSA, and not the Department of Defense, as a lot of people think. The DoD is in charge of delivery systems, and NNSA is in charge of the weapons themselves. So anyway, so I was working in the Office of Safety, Infrastructure, and Operations, doing some admins, kind of like whatever they wanted me to do, basically. And it wasn't an office that I loved. I didn't get up in the morning. I wasn't excited about nuclear infrastructure like HVAC systems and buildings and trailers. That was not what I got excited about. But I learned a ton about budgets, and I learned a ton about congressional interactions and affairs and how decisions get made and to who gets the money. And quite frankly, I realized that one of the biggest problems with the nuclear system in the United States is that much of our facilities are from the Manhattan Project and the Cold War era and are falling apart. So it's pretty hard to talk about, weapons systems when you are working in a trailer where your roof is caving in. And these are important issues that matter, because these are the workforce doing all of the important work. So I learned, again, something else that I had no idea about. I think a lot of people don't have any idea about. And learn a lot of hard skills that were really important. And so I did treat that job as if it was very important. And I wasn't there for that long before I had 2 other offers from different offices at NNSA who I routinely worked with,
Did you pursue those
to
offers, or
transition as a federal employee into those offices.
did
So
they come to
yeah,
you, or did you like
yeah.
pursue? Did you tell people you were interested in, or did they kind of come to you?
I actually didn't. I didn't tell anybody that I was looking to leave. One of the offices that I'm currently in, the Office of Public Affairs, I worked with regularly. I was the person in my office who handled all of our public affairs issues from a programmatic level. That person who I worked with in public affairs was leaving his job to become the speechwriter for the administrator, the National Nuclear Security Administration. And we just had a really good relationship. I think he liked me as a person, but I like to think it was also because I was really good at that job. So he recommended me for his replacement, to be his replacement. And the public affairs office reached out to me, and they said they were interested actually on the same day that another office reached out to me. So it was just, the world works in mysterious ways. And yeah, so they gave me a great offer. I really liked the team. And so that's how I ended up where I am now. And I think it was a big leap of faith for me, because public affairs is not where I saw myself. I mean, if you had asked me at any point in my life if I would end up doing public affairs, that is not what I would tell you I would be doing right now. I have friends who went to school and have master's degrees in public affairs and communication background. I am still a policy subject matter expert. But all of that being said, I love my job. I adore what I do day in and day out. I think that I have a very type A personality. It's very quirky. It's very strong, and that doesn't always sit super well with certain kinds of jobs. I think that's why I sort of grew out of doing research. It didn't quite fit my personality type. I worked well in my Office of Safety, Infrastructure, and Operations, but I was working every single day with engineers, and I think my personality was possibly a little abrasive there as well. And so this job is like a Cinderella's shoe. I mean, it fits me just right. And so I think it's important to remember, like Anne said, it doesn't, start is certainly not where you're going to end up, but more often than not, it is not where you will be. But that's okay, because the things that you try along the way help you get to a place where you find something you're really good at and where you excel. And all of the things that I have done along the way have made me great at my job right now. I mean, the people that I met at Brookings, they're world-class people. I know personally leaders, like foreign leaders of other countries. I have met with those who are negotiating arms control agreements with Russia right now. I know the people working on the North Korea issues right now. Like, I know those people, and I have their phone numbers, and that's something all those little steps along the way, hopefully it leads you to a place where it makes you successful in what you enjoy doing.
So I'm going to ask Kate 2 more questions. I'm going to ask her to talk substantively a little bit about some of the issues that she works with. And then I'm going to ask her where she wants to end up in 5 years, 10 years, so that you guys can kind of get an idea of, someone who's in the process of building this kind of career. Like, also, we've been talking about how she got where she is now, but someday, Kate's going to be one of the people negotiating those treaties, I'm guessing. I'm wondering if you could just talk really broadly about you're mentioning the arms control with Russia, or the, whatever with North Korea, but just broadly about how learning the background to all this informs what you do, because you said that was really important. Like, everything up to now, it's like you sort of made a little bit of a career shift into public affairs at the moment, but you still draw on all that and you use that language.
Yeah. Gosh, it's a good question, and I actually think more complicated than.
Well, I know you have limits on what you can say too. So
No. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so on a day in and day out basis, my primary job is as media incomings come in, which we get a lot of questions from the media related to nuclear issues. We put together responses for those inquiries. And you can do that job if you have a background in public affairs. You know that there are issues and key themes that you just don't say. You would never say that to the public, even if that's the truth or whatever. But if you know an issue fundamentally to its core, you can write those things much better into a way that the public can both understand them better, into a way where you put sort of the bigger, broader context of the issue. They might be asking about one very specific question, but they're sort of missing the bigger implications of that, and so you can sort of lead your answer to that media inquiry to maybe where you want them to be. There have been some things that have happened in the news this week related to a well-known treaty, and we're working on questions are coming in on that, and we're putting out press releases or media holding statements as they relate to that bigger, broader issue. And even though, I work on safety and infrastructure, project acquisition, management, construction, all of those things still do fit into a treaty like New START, for example. There are other aspects of those treaties that you don't necessarily see, that they're not the sexiest thing to talk about, but they are really important. So I think, when it comes to strategic stability, that's the question that gets thrown around a lot and talked about a lot in academia and for experts in the field. It's not exactly the easiest concept to understand if you're just the public opening the newspaper and reading it. So when you get sort of questions that are more strategic stability focused from a trade press, you want to put it into a context that makes sense to an average everyday person. I don't enjoy using a lexicon that's, you need a Harvard education to understand. I like breaking down issues for regular people to understand, because I fundamentally think nuclear issues are incredibly important and more people should pay attention to them. But if we're going to help the public be well informed on these issues, then we need to put it into a context that's relatable to them, that they understand, using words that make sense to them. And I think that that's what I bring to the table, sort of understanding the big strategic pieces, and then understanding now sort of the programmatic issues that are a little bit more technical, and then bringing to it a very personalized aspect, if that makes sense.
I was just wondering how you found being like a female in the industry. Obviously, it's really dominated by guys. Like, how have you found like being taken seriously, I suppose?
So it's a great question. One thing that Anne didn't mention, and I'm happy to talk with you and anyone about, is that I work a lot on this specific issues. I have written pretty extensively about breaking barriers for women in STEM and national security. Sit on the board for Girl Security, which is an organization that is trying to close the gap in the national security pipeline. It's a very real thing, and it's a very daunting question. It's a very daunting issue to have to deal with on a day in and day out basis. And I would be lying to you if I said that being a female in this male dominated field does not affect me personally, and that it doesn't get in the way of me doing my job, because it does, more times than I care to admit. I think it affected me a lot more when I was very first being a new person in the field, with folks who have been there for a very long time, and knowing when's the right time to voice your concerns, when to raise your hand, when to step up and say something. That's already hard when you're just entering the field, and it's 10 times harder when you're a woman trying to figure it out in a room of just men. And that happened to me at a roundtable event every week. I was one or maybe there were two of us if I was lucky. So it is tricky, and I'm still trying to navigate it myself. But the best thing that I have done is just try to know the issues as well as I possibly can. I never want to give anyone an excuse to question my intellect by not knowing an issue. You can't be prepared all the time, but when you're going into a meeting, to just be overly prepared, because unfortunately women just need to be overly prepared. Hold on, I'm going to shut my window because there are people outside.
One of the things that Kate said to me not very long ago was that she really liked reading Wendy Sherman's biography.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, you can tell me what you liked. You can tell her what you liked about it, but it just reminds me of what you liked about it. Reminds me of her question.
I don't remember explicitly what I told you, but I think I said something to the effect of how she uses the stories in her life to help her overcome issues on a regular basis, about like what it's like to be a woman in everyday life, and how those things sort of benefited her when she was doing negotiations. She was one of the ones who also negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, and in her book she has a couple of stories where she talks about something that she learned back in her youth, and how she used being a woman in that room actually to help that negotiation move along. And I thought that was really beneficial. One other thing that's incredibly important is that there are a ton of women in this field. There are a ton of women coming into the field. There are a ton of women, a ton left, but there are women left who paved the way for you. And those women want to help other women. And I have a group of girls who, are around, and we talk via chat, and we met in person before COVID regularly to sort of just voice our concerns and get it all out there so that it didn't come out in any other way. And those people, having mentorship and having allyship does make a huge difference in just not letting the shit, get you down. So, but yeah, I think now that I've been around long enough and I know what I bring to the table, it still happens. It's still frustrating, but it doesn't get to me quite as much now as it used to. So,
one of the things that I find in my career is that you can have a lot of really great male mentors who are really invested in making sure that you helping you succeed. The thing that I struggled with was not having role models, right? So the issue was sort of that I would have great male mentorship, but I wouldn't necessarily have women who are ahead of me who I could see, how they are, dealing with various challenges. Personal, professional life. And, it was sort of like, felt like I was kind of making it up on my own. And so I think the kinds of community that Kate is talking about building through organizations like Girl Security is really important. So Kate, I want to wrap this up on time for you because I know that you were very busy. Would you care to answer my last question about where you see yourself in 5?
Yeah.
What are your career goals?
Okay. Let me just say two things real quick, and then I'll answer that question for you. So, Sam, thanks so much for that question, Samantha. Sam, if you are interested in this field and you are looking for a mentor, I do encourage you to look at girlsecurity.org because they have a mentorship program in place, and they are launching programming in the UK as well, where they match you with a mentor who is like one ladder step ahead of you in your career. So it's a really cool model to help you find a mentor if you're looking for one in the national security field.
Definitely.
So I recommend that.
And Kate, we're actually building something
that sounds amazing.
Enriched that is everyone.
Yes, so. We will have that same thing through Enriched, which Anne can tell you all about. And then
thank you.
Yeah, of course. And then for where I see myself in 5 to 10 years, it's a really good question. When you emailed me that you were going to ask that, I was like, oh, Jesus, I don't know what I'm going to say.
It's a horrible question to have to answer, but
yeah. When I was working at Brookings and when I first came over to the government, what I really wanted to be was a deputy assistant secretary or an assistant secretary. I used to think at State Department, and then that sort of moved over to wanting to work at the Defense Department. Verification area, or possibly in the policy department. And I think maybe this is a bit of COVID speaking, but I'm not positive if my long-term career trajectory includes government anymore. I do like my job right now very much, and on any given day, you know, I change my mind about where I want to end up. But I really love public education on these issues. I feel very strongly that you know, women and generation should have access to this information and know how to use it. And I still love politics so much. So I think maybe moving into education at some point, or something to do with public education and national security is definitely where I see myself in the long term. And who knows what will happen.
Fantastic. Kate, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation immensely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.